Well, I'll introduce Roberto in just a moment, but I just wanted to let you know that so Roberto Frega is here from Paris and also from Italy, from both places, and he's going to be giving a campus talk on normativity and sort of global crisis, sort of talk about the human beings as normative creatures. And that talk is going to be on October the 8th, that's a Monday, at 2 p.m. in St. Cajetan. So if you're interested and you're available, we'd love to see you there. Also on October 9th, so the day after, on Tuesday, he's going to be teaching my class on giving a Dewey seminar. We're going to sort of have an open class on October 9th, and for that class we're going to be reading pieces by Axel Honneth and Richard Bernstein on democracy and political theory. So if those are of interest to you, we're going to get some food, we're going to sort of make it a kind of symposium. It's going to be a class and it's going to extend longer. So that's from 2 to about 4 or 4:30 on Tuesday, October 9th, and you're all welcome to come to both. Roberto Frega has a PhD from Paris 8 University. He is a researcher in philosophy at the École des Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. The Paris Institute. Yesterday I had him say it for me. But he's published several books and articles on pragmatism in American philosophy, and he's the founder and co-executive editor of the European Journal of Pragmatism in American Philosophy, and was a co-organizer of the first European Pragmatism Conference in Rome just a couple of weeks ago, last week, where there were pragmatists and American people focusing on American philosophy from nearly a dozen countries. Roberto has published 2 monographs on Dewey's philosophy, a book on contemporary theories of rationality in American philosophy, a book on pragmatist moral and political philosophy, and more than 20 articles on contemporary moral and political philosophy. He's also edited a number of different volumes, including a selection of Dewey's epistemological essays. I asked him, just for the sake of sort of general information, what his sort of main philosophical influences have been, and he listed them sort of in recent chronological order: John Dewey, George Herbert Mead, Charles Peirce, Jürgen Habermas, Michel Foucault, Friedrich Nietzsche, Gilles Deleuze, and Ludwig Wittgenstein. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and please welcome Roberto.
Thank you very much for being here. The talk I'm going to give today, there is a handout which basically you can follow the talk on it, just to overcome the difficulty of understanding my English. The idea is to introduce you, to give a picture of pragmatism as a social philosophy, and to locate it with contemporary mainstream understanding of what social philosophy is. And the idea is just to try to see that pragmatism is a sort of third, independent and irreducible social philosophy, and maybe that may be interesting to see how do you conceive or how do you see this way of situating pragmatism between big major giants like political liberalism and political theory, etc. The talk is going to be about 40 minutes. So it is certainly not an easy task to provide a relatively non-controversial definition of what social philosophy is. And a more manageable and probably also more interesting task is to inquire about the main traditions through which its meaning is currently being spelled. And this is basically what I'm going to do today. Most theorists would probably agree that social philosophy is, as most trending philosophy are, clearly divided along the cultural and linguistic bridge separating the English-speaking, analytically oriented tradition from the continental one. But I will claim that this is not an accurate picture, and that to make it more precise, we should add a third tradition, which will show up as pragmatism. Now, the expression social philosophy dates back at least at 1733, when it appears in a French text of Moses de Brusca. Since then, the expression and its cognates in other European languages, such as philosophie sociale and sociale philosophie, have proliferated. Today, the meanings appear to cluster around two rather distinct uses. On the one hand, the term is used within the Anglo-American tradition in a way that is nearly synonym with political philosophy, to emphasize the social side of traditional political issues like justice or theory of institutions. This way of understanding what social philosophy is reflects a use that has been generally common through the modern British tradition, when a lesser degree of academic specialization made it less compelling to accurately distinguish the social from the moral and the political spheres. On the other hand, a second and markedly distinct conception and practice of social philosophy can be found in continental philosophy within the tradition of critical theory, especially thanks to the recent efforts of Axel Honneth at revivifying a philosophical tradition otherwise on the verge of oblivion. In this tradition, the concept of social philosophy is more clearly marked off from those of moral and political philosophy. Now, by claiming social philosophy to be an enterprise radically distinct from, and to some extent even opposed to political philosophy, and by reclaiming it as a distinctive way of understanding the relationship between theory and practice, critical theorists militate in support of a more technical use of this expression. And it is this use that has made more cogent and compelling the question of what social philosophy is, and what does it mean to be or not to be a social philosopher. Indeed, according to this use, to be a social philosopher doesn't merely mean to be concerned with social or political issues, but rather to display a much larger philosophical, intellectual, and even political orientation. In a way that finds no equivalent in the standard analytical use, in the perspective opened by critical theorists, to reclaim to be a social philosopher has come therefore to assume a plurality of meanings that largely transcend the rather idle question of academic classification. This move has of course raised the stakes associated with being or not being a social philosopher, and as a consequence has fostered the need to look more deeply into this apparently non-problematic distinction between the two traditions of social philosophy. What appears now is that this way of defining the field of social philosophy is insufficient, as it exasperates the opposition between its extremes, obscuring what stands in the middle. On the one hand, hardcore normative analytical theory, and on the other hand, radical emancipatory critical theory. My claim is that to get a more perspicuous grasp of what social philosophy is, we need to fill this gap, and that to do this, we should add a third tradition to these pictures, one that questions at the same time the linguistic and the geographical criteria of this taken for granted partition. This third tradition, as I said a moment ago, is that of pragmatism, a philosophic school whose origins antedates the great analytical continental divide, and whose lineage shares many elements with the other two traditions. On the one hand, pragmatism shares with the Anglo-American tradition in social philosophy an ascendancy in British empiricism. On the other hand, it shares with the European social philosophy an ascendancy in German 19th century philosophy. These historical facts largely account for the difficulty to classify pragmatism as a third distinct tradition in social philosophy. And this is the reason why I want to try here to disentangle the thread of this threefold cord, claiming that pragmatism should be acknowledged as a third and autonomous tradition in social philosophy. I begin by highlighting the essential feature of what I've dubbed before Anglo-American tradition in social philosophy, but that is probably best captured by the expression analytical social philosophy. This account will be of course very sketchy, as it will serve only to trace an ideal typical model against which to compare the other two conceptions. So forgive the very simplified understanding I'm going to give. So analytical or Anglo-American social philosophy cannot be taken to be a very clearly identified discipline, and the boundaries between moral, social, and political philosophy tend to be in general blurred. I take, for example, a book from James Serba in 2001, which was called Social and Political Philosophy, as a fairly representative example of this tradition, in that it does not make any conceptual effort to disentangle social from political philosophy, and because he conceives social and political philosophy as a justificatory project aimed, I'm quoting him, at grounding morality on the widely shared norms of rationality, end of quote. The social here stands merely for the non-individual as a source of normative obligations, in a way that is opposed, for example, to utilitarianism or to libertarian moral and political doctrines. So in this perspective, basically questions of justice, distribution, toleration, basic rights can be studied under either the heading political philosophy or social philosophy, and without there being a really significant difference between the one or the other. And this is basically also the reason why, if you see in the literature, many of these books are just called social and political philosophy, or maybe they call themselves social philosophy, but then they start saying, I'm going to write about political philosophy, or the other way around. So for the sake of my present analysis, what I take to be the distinguishing traits characterizing analytical social philosophy, and which are worth mentioning, are the following. First, the commitment to methodological individualism. Second, the preference for conceptual rather than for empirical analysis. Third, a clear demarcation between normative and descriptive theory. Fourth, a clear demarcation between the domain of philosophy, normative analysis, and that of the social sciences, explanation and forecast. Fifth, the commitment to a justificatory rather than to a critical understanding of the task of social philosophy. Sixth, the commitment to a science-like conception of philosophy and the consequent generalized dismissal of emancipation as a direct and consciously entertained goal of social philosophy. And seventh, a conception of social philosophy as not sharply distinct from political philosophy. If we now move to the continental tradition of social philosophy, and in particular to the tradition of critical theory, we find a completely different understanding of what social philosophy is, a conception there is that is opposed to the present one point by point. So that social ontology replaces methodological individualism, empirical analysis are given priority and considered as an essential ingredient of normative theory, all concern with demarcation are rejected, critiques takes pride of place over justification as the overarching normative goal, and the science-based conception of philosophy is consciously replaced with an emancipatory program. Now I'm going to enter in a little bit in this understanding of social philosophy. And this will be basically the benchmark I'm using to contrast it with pragmatism. In the text presenting his program of research at the Institute for Social Research at the beginning of the 30s, Max Horkheimer wrote, I'm quoting him, "The general conception that one connects with social philosophy can be put concisely. Its ultimate aim is the philosophical interpretation of the vicissitudes of human fate, the fate of humans not as mere individuals, however, but as members of a community. It is thus, above all, concerned with phenomena that can only be understood in the context of human social life, with the state, law, economy, religion, in short, with the entire material and intellectual culture of humanity." End of quote. As he then explains, the first sense in which philosophy is social is that of a commitment to social ontology. And more recently, in Honnet's words, quoting him, "Critical theory presupposes a normative ideal of society that is incompatible with the individualistic premises of the liberal tradition." End of quote. The second trait that Horkheimer employs to describe social philosophy is the absence of a sharp demarcation between philosophy and the social sciences. And this is, by the way, the research program he set for the research institutes he was going to direct for 2 decades. In that perspective, the first task of social philosophy was to provide a theoretical framework for the study of the interconnection among the economic life of society, the psychic development of the individual, and the cultural sphere. And philosophical theses were expected to be backed with empirical findings from the social sciences. The third trait that for Horkheimer characterizes social philosophy is its critical orientation. Horkheimer has largely insisted on the idea that theoretical reflection is embedded in the social context from which it stems, so that a purely representative understanding of science as objective knowledge of reality must be dropped. This thesis is at the basis of his call for a transition from what he called traditional to what he now calls critical theory. As one of the main postulates upon which traditional epistemologists relied was precisely the idea of knowledge as a cumulative enterprise to be conducted in independence from the social situation in which it was carried on. It is because of the social determination of human action that a critical theory is needed. As critical theory is precisely that form of human activity, I'm quoting Horkheimer, which has society itself for its object. End of quote. But social philosophy is critical also in a second and more specific sense, as it aims at offering a critique of society as it stands. I'm quoting again Horkheimer. Although it itself emerges from social structure, its purpose is not, either in its conscious intention or in objective significance, the better functioning of any element in the structure. On the contrary, it, where it of course is critical theory, is suspicious of the very categories of better, useful, appropriate, productive, and valuable, as these are understood in the present order, and refuses to take them as non-scientific presuppositions about which one can do nothing. End of quote. In the second sense, critical theory urges a transformation of society as a whole. For the first generation of critical theorists, and later also for Honneth, social philosophy must go critical also because the pervasiveness of the social pathologies it wishes to unmask and to overcome is such that they are generally unperceived by those that undergo them. This is the meaning conveyed by typical critical concepts such as those of alienation, reification, fetishism, social anomie, social pathology, pathologies of reason. For Honneth, I'm quoting him, such concepts are means to characterize a system of convictions and practices that has the paradoxical quality of distracting one's attention from the very social conditions that structurally produce that system. End of quote. Critique, in this sense, proceeds by unmasking and unveiling pathological conditions that are not perceived as such, and to do this, the critical theorist has to raise himself against established opinions. From these premises, Horkheimer concluded, I'm quoting him, the real social function of philosophy lies in its criticism of what is prevalent. The chief aim of such criticism is to prevent mankind from losing itself in those ideas and activities which the existing organization of society instills into its members. End of quote. A further and last distinctive trait of critical theory, of critical social philosophy, has been lately identified by Honneth, who proposes to define social philosophy by its object, that he qualifies as the task, I'm quoting him, of determining and discussing processes of social development that can be viewed as misdevelopments, disorders of social pathologies. End of quote. According to this view, social philosophy has a threefold task. Firstly, it is committed to providing a positive normative standard, the idea of a fulfilled life, against which specific pathologies can be detected. Secondly, it must provide a definition of pathology suited to empirical inquiries into specific social situations. Finally, it must produce specific diagnoses of social pathologies. So now, in what follows, I'm trying to dress a model of what would be what is social philosophy according to the pragmatist tradition, and we're going to see some elements of similarity and difference between the first two traditions, but especially with respect to critical theory, because I think that there are many more elements of proximity between these two traditions, and maybe it's more interesting to develop this comparison than the other one. But of course the other can be done as well. So to show where pragmatism stands with respect to these two traditions, I will discuss some passages from some of the texts that John Dewey published between 1919 and 1930. John Dewey, in fact, is a philosopher, the pragmatist philosopher that has mostly contributed to the development of a distinctively pragmatist social philosophy. Now, the only formal definition Dewey gave of social philosophy comes from a syllabus, so from an unpublished text, for a philosophy course that dates back to 1923. Here, I'm quoting him, he defined social philosophy is concerned with the evaluation of social phenomena. The latter include all the customs, institutions, arrangements, purposes, and policies that depend upon human association or the living together of men. End of quote. So here we see that Dewey defines the aim of social philosophy as the production of normative standards for evaluating social phenomena, starting from an immanent examination of these social phenomena themselves. Accordingly, the task of social philosophy, I'm quoting him, is to carry further the process of reflective valuation, which is found as an integral part of social phenomena, apart from general theorizing. Social philosophy is a technique for clarifying the judgments which are constantly passed of necessity upon social customs, institutions, laws, arrangements, actual and projected. His subject matter involves a study of the influence of distinct types of social groupings upon the generation of beliefs and standards as to right and wrong, good and bad. And second, of the reflex reaction of these beliefs and standards upon other social forces with special regard to their effect upon the production of goods and bads by these social forces. His purpose is to render the social criticism and projections of policies which is always going on more enlightened and effective. End of quote. Here, what is clearly stated is that the task of social philosophy is to define normative standards to be used to evaluate social situations, and that secondarily of producing critiques of social situations that do not live up to these standards. The third criteria by which Dewey qualifies social philosophy is its practice-oriented nature. For Dewey, social philosophy is first of all a philosophy that deals with empirically circumscribed social problems. It says clear of general answers supposed to have a universal meaning that covers and dominates all particulars. Social philosophy, in that sense, is neither a variant of ideal theory nor an attempt to provide a general account of what society is. So conceived, social philosophy denotes a way of doing philosophy rather than a simple subfield of philosophical inquiries. What social philosophy must offer are not conceptual or dialectical solutions to perceived problems, nor general prescriptions. Social philosophy must be problem-oriented, which means driven by the empirical examination of singular problematic situations and to the pragmatic identification, quoting Dewey, of working instrumentalities to be employed and tested in clarifying concrete social difficulties. End of quote. A non-negligible feature of Dewey's social philosophy concerns his understanding of the social, or what is the social, as a general philosophical category. In an article published in 1927, Dewey has defended the claim that the social must be considered to be the most general or most inclusive category of philosophy, one to which general categories such as nature or mind would have to be subordinated. In that essay, Dewey proposed to consider the category of associated behavior as a general trait of every existence. I'm quoting him, this fact being noted, we observe that the qualities of associated things are displayed only in association, since in interactions alone are potentialities released and actualized. Furthermore, the manifestation of potentialities varies with the manner and range of association. End of quote. Association is meant here by Dewey not in the sense of associationist psychology, but in the genuine pragmatist sense according to which the meaning and identity of existing entities is determined by their interaction with other entities. As a consequence, I'm quoting him again, the more numerous and varied the forms of association into which anything enters, the better basis we have for describing and understanding it. For the more complex is an association, the more fully are potentialities released for observation. End of quote. In this perspective, with the social as a distinctive mode of association is denoted specifically human forms of grouping. Now, the first implication of this inclusive approach to the social is that no opposition is intended between the social and the other categories, that on the contrary are said to be included in that which is the most inclusive. A decisive upshot of this approach is that for Dewey the meaning of the physical, biological, and psychological constitution of human being cannot be grasped without the proper reference to the social dimension. Dewey's point is that the social is not only an emergent property that completes the meaning of the physical, biological, and mental forms of existence, but that in addition, no satisfactory explanation of any dimension of human experience can hope to be successful that does not take its social implication adequately into account. In particular, Dewey stresses how making the social the inclusive philosophic idea can help overcome all the dichotomous ways of thinking by which philosophy has traditionally pitted the individual against the social, the private against the public, the natural against the spiritual, the objectivity of the outer world against the subjectivity of the internal. Seen from this perspective, Dewey's subordination or inclusion of the political to the social is but a local consequence of a much broader philosophical strategy. These few remarks are advanced only to show that Dewey's commitment to the social of social philosophy goes much farther than the statement of a social ontology for the purposes of social and political philosophy. Another trait of Jewish social philosophy that is worth emphasizing for the purposes of my theme is the place it provides to conflict. That conflict is the central category of Jewish moral, social, and political philosophy may surprise some, as pragmatism has been generally accused of being acquiescent with existing normative orders. Contrary to this received and wrong opinion, I want to show you to which extent Jewish political and social thought is capable of taking the conflictual dimension of human life into consideration. And to prove this, I will make a short detour through Jewish moral theory. Dewey has stated in the clearest way that the central and most neglected object of moral theory, and consequently of moral experience, and quoting him, concerns the element of uncertainty and conflict in any situation which can properly be called moral. This is from his text called ethics. And it is with reference to this understanding of the nature of moral situations, or more generally of what moral experience is, that he defines the main function of moral theory. Moral theory has, according to Dewey, a threefold duty, threefold task. It must, I'm quoting him, first, generalize the types of moral conflicts which arise, thus enabling a perplexed and doubtful individual to clarify his own particular problem by placing it in a larger context. Second, it can state the leading way in which such problems have been intellectually dealt with by those who have thought upon such matters. Third, it can render personal reflection more systematic and enlightened, suggesting alternatives that might otherwise be overlooked, and stimulating greater consistency in judgment. End of quote. Dewey takes conflict to be endemic to human life. This is the reason why conflict is, to start, the central category of moral theory, and then of social and political theory. But more deeply, one finds the notion of conflict at the heart of Jewish anthropology and social psychology, as it can be inferred even by a superficial reading of human nature and conduct, where progress, transformation, adaptation to changing circumstances all comes from the capacity to produce temporary equilibrium between conflicting instances. Now, social conflict is given pride of place in social philosophy, here again in a sort of derivative way, because social conflict is but one of the manifestations of conflict as a general trait of human experience. It is the type of conflict that emerges in the associational phase, in the dynamic interaction through which individuals gather in groups on the basis of interest they share. And quoting him, the origin of social problems requiring reflective choice is found in conflict of group interest. A conflict of or failure or adjustment of one person to others is social when it reflects opposed claims of groups. End of quote. Social conflict is then but the reverse side of this natural fact, I would say, of social life, as by pursuing their group interests, human groups come naturally into conflict, about recognition, about resources, about the use of force. And the task of social philosophy, conceived as a kind of social inquiry, consists first of all in the following, I'm quoting you again, to observe the causes of social conflict, to find out what groups have become too dominating and have come to exercise disproportionate power, as well as to identify the groups that have been oppressed, denied privilege and opportunity. End of quote. This is the central task of social philosophy, as, I'm quoting again Dewey, only by making such an accurate diagnosis can we hope to prevent social infection and build a healthier society. End of quote. Now, another distinguishing trait of Jewish social philosophy is the prioritization he gives of the social over the political. Dewey assigned to social philosophy a quite broad object, we have seen this, and this partially explains the somehow vague idea one gets by weaving together Dewey's different remarks about this discipline, or about this notion. Society, as the object of social philosophy, I'm quoting him, covers all the ways in which by associating together men share their experiences and build up common interests and aims. Here another quote. Society is the process of associating in such ways that experiences, ideas, emotions, values are transmitted and made common. End of quote. Social philosophy is the theory and practice of human association in all their possible forms. It deals with the ways to promote new forms of communal association, as communication, sharing, and interaction are for Dewey the source of all goods, that are to be had by human beings. So Dewey sees social philosophy as the theory of human association, and its aim is to provide an account of the dynamic or interplay among individuals within society. Its object is to explain how to make human association flourish and to foster processes of better communication, as communication is the medium through which human beings stay together. So here again you see how the normative and the descriptive just are fused together. It is a theory of grouping rather than of groups, as its focus is the forming and unforming of groups and the multiple relations that ties individuals to other individuals in any possible associative form. In that sense, social philosophy has a transformative and emancipatory end. As Dewey said in his Ethics, one of the aims of its aim is to provide guidelines for achieving better forms of human association. And this is for this reason that the relation between social and political philosophy is a relation of inclusion. So basically, neither of equivalence nor of opposition, but of inclusion. Political philosophy as the theory of political institutions is but an application of social philosophy to a specific form of human association. And I think that it is in this sense that we should conceive Dewey's concern for democracy as being more than a mere technical device for forming government. For Dewey, the concept of democracy belonged to social before than to political philosophy, as it is part of this general theory of human association. In this sense, Dewey's idea of democracy as a way of life should not be interpreted as implying a perfectionist theory of democracy. Democracy names every form of human association that respects some organizational or social principle. First of all, the principle of the freedom to experiment and of choice for individuals in undergoing social activities. And secondly, the principle of the assignment to individuals of responsibilities in their undertaking of social tasks and in the shaping of social goods. As you can see, none of these principles is political in nature, and both apply potentially to any form of human association. In fact, for Dewey, their aim is in general to foster the achievement of personal and collective goods. And Dewey's argument in defense of democracy as a form of collective organization is precisely, quoting him, "The society which we desire is one in which there is maximum opportunity for free exchange and communication. This is the ultimate criterion by which we judge the worth of any sort of institutional arrangement." End of quote. So the defense of democracy as a political regime follows as a corollary of the social thesis. Quoting him, "The essence of democratic political theory is that it promotes social communication, cooperation, and interaction among individuals." End of quote. It is the form of government that best suits this human need. The priority of the social over the political can be better grasped in Dewey's theory of the public and in his theory of the state or of democracy, as he sees states and governments as being but some among several social agencies through which social conflicts arising from social association can be managed. But what gets priority in his analysis is the social dimension of association and conflict at all the level at which they take place. Similarly, his theory of the political is a theory of how people gather together to pursue and protect their own interests, and political institutions are seen as a specific answer to a class of social conflicts. I'm coming to what I think to be the last criteria I'm proposing you to define a pragmatist social philosophy, and this maybe will come as no surprise. This is emancipation. Although emancipation is a term rarely used by Dewey, one can say that no 20th century philosophy has insisted more than his on the emancipatory function of social theory, that Dewey describes instead by the terms of transformation and reconstruction, two terms that are technical in his philosophy. How does pragmatism consider that emancipation should be attained? In Dewey's text, we find several strategies by which social philosophy can fulfill its emancipatory function. The most recurrent are the following. First, by fostering processes of social learning and knowledge distribution through educational reform, active involvement with the media, and so on. Second, by theorizing and promoting processes of democratic participation and public formation at all levels of social life, from civic associationism to political activity. Third, by promoting social reform. Fourth, by criticizing and denouncing forms of exploitation such as gender or race oppression. As a textual evidence of what I'm saying, one may remark that a significant share of the occurrences of the expression social philosophy in Dewey's text concern precisely educational matter. Education is for Dewey one of the major issues of social philosophy, as it provides one of the most important tools for social emancipation. As he stated in a text tellingly titled My Pedagogical Creed, education is the fundamental method of social progress and reform. End of quote. This early statement finds important echoes in later and fundamental texts such as Democracy and Education, where among other things Dewey claims that, I'm quoting him, the very idea of education is a fraying of individual capacity in progressive growth directed at social aims. End of quote. Education is for Dewey one of the central medium between the individual and society. Through it, not only social norms and values are transferred to the new generations, but also opportunities for individualization are created, as the individual is taught how to intensify his own experience by both creating new opportunities for self-realization and how to integrate his search for self-realization within the social context. Secondly, that democratic participation may have a decisive emancipatory function is a central thesis of any pragmatist social philosophy, and one that, as I have shown, is at the heart of Dewey's social as well as political philosophy. As I said above, the commitment to democratic participation is a direct consequence of Dewey's social philosophy, as long as it sees in associative interactions the main causes of human goods and evils. Therefore, by empowering individuals' chances to formulate and discuss their claims and to participate in decision-making processes, we can increase the opportunities of reducing social sufferings and contrasting oppression and exploitation. The reappropriation of the Jeffersonian idea of self-government as a practice extending from the town meeting to state level is one of the ways by which Dewey has articulated his concern for the emancipatory role of democratic participation. Thirdly, for Dewey, emancipation is the expected outcome of a whole wide array of normative practices, among which there certainly is critique, but also social reform. For Dewey, as well as for many of the pragmatists, the prospect of criticism and reform go hand in hand. In addition, the legitimation of the institution through justificatory practices, I'm thinking of philosophical tasks, such as the justification of democracy, might in some circumstances constitute an appropriate strategy to empower a social situation. In particular, at times of institutional crisis, to provide legitimacy to political institutions in the face of momentous political and theoretical aggression may be the most urgent normative practice. Fourthly, and without going into greater details, we should reject the rather spread idea that pragmatism is a form of ironism, lacking the tools for social critique. One has only to refer to the account Dewey provides of the genesis of democracy out of a joint process of liberation from previous forms of social oppression, as well as out of the liberation of the Promethean energies of capitalism. This double genesis explains why for Dewey the rise of an individual has been a mixed blessing, as the individual as the new figure of the modern era emerges precisely at the time when new and unprecedented corporate forms of action, the very antithesis of individualism, were coming upon the scene of history. Dewey points explicitly to the paradox that emerges when we acknowledge that the liberal celebration of the individual as the sole and last source of every idea, desire, want, goes hand in hand with the rise of huge and unprecedented powers capable of shaping every aspect of the lives of individuals. Dewey comes therefore at a conclusion that lays the ground open for social critique. I'm quoting him: "The same forces which have brought about the forms of democratic government, general suffrage, executives and legislators chosen by majority vote, have also brought about conditions which halt the social and humane ideals that demand the utilization of government as the genuine instrumentality of an inclusive and fraternally associated public." End of quote. Yet, in his view, this acknowledgement does not call for a radical overturn of present society, but rather for the search for a new kind of political agencies capable of fostering the goods and inhibiting the evils that the modern revolution had brought about. To conclude, I will recapitulate which are the points of convergence between the pragmatist and the critical theory conceptions of social philosophy, and which are, in my mind, the main points on which the two programs of social philosophy part ways. Now, pragmatism and critical theory share, first of all, what I have called the social ontology. They both reject the assumption of methodological individualism or atomism, and take the individual to be in his own constitution deeply dependent upon society and history. Secondly, they share the view that theory and practice are deeply entangled, that theory must be seen as an aspect of the socially shaped practical activity of agents, or maybe if you want, that theory is a part of a theory of praxis. Thirdly, out of the practical understanding of theoretical knowledge, they both reject what Dewey dubbed the spectator theory of knowledge, that is to say, a conception of knowledge as the external representation of states of affairs. As a fourth shared trait, we should mention the critique of the foundational conception of philosophy and the idea that philosophy should deal with concrete objects related to social experience, that it should avoid solving social problems by the mere dialectical play of concepts, and that to do this, it should enter a new and collaborative relationship with the social sciences, adopting an empirical and even an experimental attitude. Although in different ways, both traditions reject the idea of armchair philosophy and urge philosophy to become less concerned with conceptual analysis and more concerned with the empirical condition of social life. The fifth trait that these two social philosophies share is the emancipatory or transformative conception of the role of philosophy. Although they may conceive of emancipation in quite similar ways, they both believe that the task of social philosophy is to support processes of social transformation, aimed at bettering the circumstances of social life, at reducing injustices and oppression. The study of society is seen by both of them as a way to change it, which for both implies the rejection of pure normative or ideal theory and the necessity for social philosophy to focus on the real problems of existing democracies. Now, let's turn to the differences. I see two major points on which the pragmatist and the critical theory conceptions of social philosophy diverge. The first concerns the nature and function of critique, and the second concerns the role of encompassing narratives about modern society. It should be acknowledged, for the worse or for the better, that the pragmatist conception of critique, or rather of criticism, which is a word that you would tend to prefer, does not display the radicality of that of critical theory. This for at least two reasons. The first is that pragmatism sees emancipation as a process taking place within and starting from the existing society. Therefore, it does not take to be a viable central task of social philosophy the overturn of society in its entirety. For the pragmatist, praxis is irreducibly situated in existing context. And this implies what Otto Neurath once said about language. This implies that what once Otto Neurath said about language can be said as well of the moral order that sustains our collective life. As users of normative orders, I'm quoting the famous sentence from Neurath, we are like sailors who must rebuild their ships on the open sea, never able to dismantle it in dry rock and to reconstruct it there out of the best materials. What does this metaphor tell us? It tells that normative orders cannot be addressed with one-sided attitudes, and that in the face of values and norms, we, like the sailors mentioned above, can only do repair work while being on board. We cannot step outside our normative orders so to criticize or justify them wholesale. That we, like sailors, cannot leave the ship means that justification and critiques are local normative practice to be used according to specific normative needs. The second reason why, as I said, the pragmatism has a less radical understanding of critique is that pragmatism denies that social philosophy must be critical, although it certainly agrees that it could and even should, however not in an exclusive manner. Pragmatism does not see any incompatibility between the functional reformist use of social philosophy. I use that, on the contrary, Horkheimer, for example, fully inscribes in the traditional, not critical, conception of social philosophy and the critical work. Indeed, Dewey considers criticism as one among the many normative functions social philosophy is called to fulfill. I take this as a distinctive and valuable trait of the pragmatist conception of social philosophy. The fact that it considers criticism as a necessary, invaluable, and yet only partial accomplishment of social philosophy. Justification, reform, and institutionalization of new normative orders are as legitimate and important as criticism is. So that critique is given neither epistemic nor moral or political priority with respect to other normative practices. The second point of difference concerns the leading heuristic role assigned to grid-scale narrative as the basis for diagnosis of pathologies in a critical theory tradition. Pragmatism, I think I've showed it beyond doubt, is unquestionably committed to the identification of normative standards to be used as a reference for orienting political practice and social reform. And it would be easy to show, for example, that Dewey's notion of growth fits the proceduralist requirements set by Onnet for normative standards in social philosophy. For the pragmatists, however, there is no necessary nor exclusive connection between the development of a normative account and the practice of critique, as the idea of the good society, of the society that promotes self-realization, it's a word used basically by Onnet, or that fosters association and communication in Dewey's sense, can be put to use to undertake processes of institution building and social reform rather than critique. As Dewey and all the pragmatists that gathered around him in Chicago at the turn of the century have shown, but it can be seen also in the constructive and normative role Dewey assigned to education beside critique. As Honneth and all the authors that belong to the tradition in which he has consciously inscribed himself have shown, the language of pathology and discognates, alienation, reification, disenchantment, mutilation, massification, malaise, etc., makes sense only in the context of a reject, critique, denunciation of society in its entirety. It is a language that expresses the persuasion, common to all the authors Honneth evokes, that society needs to be changed from scratch. Whereas for Horkheimer and some other representatives of this tradition, the Marxian idea of internal contradictions leading to an inevitable future crisis of modern society played the role of a central theoretical assumption, a role, by the way, that is still played for many radical theorists. Within pragmatism, we do not find an equivalent diagnosis, nor the search for general predictions about the future development of society. The pragmatists rather see the future as open and unpredictable, as the society is always in the state of permanent transformation. The foreclosure of future opportunities through a totalizing diagnosis is for the pragmatist a methodologically flawed move, both for its questionable epistemological status and because it introduces a bias in the examination of particular singular situations. This distinguo, I'm going to conclude, are not made to claim, of course, the superiority of pragmatism over critical theory, a claim difficult to defend and, more than that, I think meaningless. It would be easy, on the contrary, to point to the emancipatory importance of many of the diagnoses produced by the tradition of critical theory during his long history. The point of this talk was rather to present pragmatism as a distinct approach within the large academic field of social philosophy. An approach that I believe, shares many common features with the other tradition within this field, but which nevertheless shows element of originality that mark it off from its other better-known competitors. What I see as a major advantage of including pragmatism within the field of social philosophy is that pragmatism offers a model of social philosophy which combines the emancipatory afflatus of critical theory with a more nuanced and less prejudged attitude toward the capacity of human society to transform themselves. And to conclude, let me just remind that the reject of the dogma of social pathology has not prevented pragmatist theorists such as Wright Mills, Colin West, and more recently a younger generation of scholars, to formulate very sharp critiques of the form of social suffering that affects present American society, notably with respect to gender and race. Here are some of the main reasons why we should start to think of pragmatism as a distinct tradition in social philosophy. Thank you.
We have time for questions and comments.
I really enjoyed your presentation, learned a lot, as I'm sure the rest here would agree, that it was very interesting. And I mean, you're talking almost to an American, well, you are talking to an American audience about something that is almost in our blood, this idea of democracy, of participation, and so forth. So it resonates well, at least with me. As I recall, though, Dewey had criticisms from two sides, the Marxists or neo-Marxists like Lukács and Herkma that you cited, but I didn't think that, I thought they argued that he didn't really try to penetrate the reality of the social dynamic and then deal with it in a forceful way. And on the other side, you had theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr and Karl Marx who said, well, it's too optimistic. You're assuming that humans are nice and good and can talk to each other, but there are bad people out there, and that evil is a part of human nature that the Deweyites don't seem to incorporate in their thinking. How do you respond to these were criticisms in the 20s and 30s, so I'm not sure, I don't know what theologians or Marxists view, how they view pragmatism today, but I would think there would still be those central arguments about the optimism of Dewey. I mean, it appeals to me. I'm optimistic because that's the American culture, but it ain't so in terms of the realities of much of the world.
How would I respond? Concerning to the criticism of the first generation of the critical theory, I think there are basically two responses. One was given by a German scholar, which is called Andreas Hetzel, with a nice article where he shows that although you find, of course, this very harsh critical statement by Horkheimer and Marcuse about pragmatism being the American way of life, made philosophy, etc. But then at the same time, you have in the journal that we're editing in the Institute of Social Research, there are some 8 or 10 book reviews of the book of Dewey's main books in this time. And in this article, for example, you find much more appreciative understanding of Dewey's philosophy. And so I don't know whether... So this is, first of all, to say that if you look in details, the judgment of the first generation critical theory was much more nuanced than is currently said. And the second is that if you try to take seriously or to read Dewey's philosophy, as in a way I'm trying to do, for example, emphasizing the function, the concept of conflict placed in his philosophy, you see that it's not so naive or optimistic like people say. Now, there may be many reasons why things are so. One non-negligible reason, for example, is that one of the texts which more clearly is where Dewey is more explicit about this are his lectures, the lecture he delivered in China, which were published only in 1973. And these lectures doesn't have any, I mean, they have correspondences in many papers Dewey left, for example, in this syllabus for a class he wrote. But, and also I think if you read carefully, I mean, if you read the third part of his Ethics in the 32 edition, having in mind this idea, you find many more references to this idea that basically moral and social philosophy is about conflict, and everything you have to do is just to try to find new ways about dealing with them. Now, what some people say is a sort of residual critique is that what you don't find in Dewey is a theory of power. And now, although there have been lately a couple of papers trying to prove the contrary, and one notably on my journal, I basically tend to think that if you want a theory of power, you better look elsewhere. Although you can find, of course, some references, because if you have a theory of conflict, I mean, you can give some quote showing that for you it was clear that the making of a sort of business corporate society was going to foreclose the hope of a really democratic society. That in a way, what he lived when he was young in his in the town meeting way of deliberative democracy would have been very difficult to bring about at a national level, because this huge corporate power was going to influence, to shape individual minds, desire, and wills. And so I think you can say, you have for sure, I mean, you cannot say that Dewey was, like many people say, naive, overly optimistic, etc. But I think at the same time, this was sort of one of the secondary morals of my talk, was that it's probably not the best place to go. And once you have acknowledged this, if you want a theory, you don't have any sophisticated acknowledgement of psychoanalysis, for example, in Dewey. And of course, if you want to have a full-blown account of why people behave the way they behave, maybe psychoanalysis may be more useful than other things, etc. So I think my reply would be, Dewey was not so naive and so optimistic, but he did not really work out a full-blown theory of power and social conflict as the one maybe we would expect to have today.
Well, I'm not familiar with the lectures that he did in China. What are those?
What are?
His lectures in China?
It's called the Lectures in China.
Oh.
And, it's a book with this title. It's a set of 2 lectures he delivered in 1919, 1920, just after he came from Japan, where one set is about educational matters, and the second one is called Social and Political Philosophy. And there is a chapter on social philosophy, a chapter on the notion of conflict. So it's very explicit about the importance of philosophy going critical, about having a theory of conflict, about focusing on the social dimension of problems. And but they were available in Chinese until '73. And the only problem of this lecture is that the English manuscript was lost. So basically, he gave the talk in English. It was translated into Chinese in real time. Someone took notes on Chinese, and then the notes were translated back into English. So, but I mean, if you read, that's why I was hinting to this syllabus, because although it's not a published text, at least it's sure that it was written by his hand. So when he speaks of social conflicts and of social philosophy in this text, it's Dewey speaking, not a Chinese translating some strange Chinese term into the most proximate English term. But of course, one may ask why. This I'm going to ask it to myself, not to you, but why to build up an account of Dewey's social philosophy I have to rely so much on unpublished work? That might be a good question. I don't have an answer anyway.
I have a question for you, which maybe other people were thinking about. When you were identifying the different criteria that Dewey mentions as being criteria of social philosophy, you said, and I'll just read it, you said the third criteria by which Dewey qualifies social philosophy is its practice-oriented nature. For Dewey, social philosophy is first of all a philosophy that deals with empirically circumscribed social problems. Sure, everyone's okay with that. But then you say this, and this I think maybe is where a lot of people have difficulty with pragmatism in general, and also with Nietzsche and some others. So Dewey stays clear of general answers supposed to have a universal meaning that covers and dominates all particulars. In other words, Dewey is a social philosophy that's staying away from general answers with a universal meaning. And then so I suppose the question which might pop up in the mind of people is, well, how is that a philosophy? He's saying to pay attention to social problems. He's saying we have to look at practice. So far he sounds like a good social worker. But if he's not going to be giving a universal answer or developing a theory with some really very abstract implications, then I think this might be the reason that people have said about Dewey, that's not a philosophy, about Nietzsche, that's not a philosophy. So maybe you could say a word about in what sense you can pull off calling it a social philosophy if it's going to stay away from this kind of universal, general answer.
Basically, by saying that one thing Dewey is saying is that if you want to, and maybe of course this you have to be put into the context of someone speaking 100 years ago. So it was the beginning of the social sciences, so he couldn't rely on the huge amount of evidence we can have today. But I think some of these arguments are still with us. Is the idea that you should turn philosophical speculations about society, political arrangements, etc., to a much more finer analysis of how things work in the concrete, because otherwise you just go in the general abstraction. It doesn't really grip with how things really work. Now the point is, to do this, you need a sort of conceptual apparatus with what I have called the guidelines. Otherwise, I mean, it's not just saying go into the world and see what people do. And of course, the point is, if you want to make then generalization, in any case, try. The point of generalization is that you do social theory because you want to intervene into the practice. So into the practice, you intervene each time in a singular way because you're going to solve a specific. It can be a general problem, but basically the point is, what are we going to do as maybe the Americans, the Western, but maybe basically only we 20 people sharing something. So the point is, which kind of methodology, which kind of strategy, what kind of approach we are going to use to deal with the problem in this way. And then you have all this experimental theory of how, for example, to take consequences into consideration. And this, of course, has all sort of philosophical implications, because, for example, how do you assess consequences with respect to values? So you need to have a normative theory defining which is the relationship between values and facts, for example. Then you're going to have, for example, a critique of the value-fact dichotomy. And then, I mean, from a sort of general idea which go out, look and see, there comes all sorts of philosophical questions, because it's not so simple to look at the singular and to bring about some general notion just to have ideas for deciding how to act in the next step. And this is why I think, I mean, but I mean, what I wanted to emphasize in this passage was that you had the same turn in the first generation critical theory towards saying, we philosophers, if you want to do such a philosophy, we should start working with the social sciences. And this, I mean, what was new at the time it's new still today, because if you look at what is being done in the mainstream analytical Anglo-American political philosophy, it's just conceptual analysis which is not a way to say that conceptual analysis has no place, no importance, or that John Rawls got everything wrong. This is not the point, but the point is that you have two traditions which are calling for a new alliance between philosophy and the social sciences in a way that may be a little bit different, because it was clear, at least in our Chimera project, that philosophy still had to have a sort of leading role in orienting social research. So in saying to a sociologist what you should go in to look for, and then philosophy would have made a sort of general ideas. Also, for example, I think you find in Honneth and in Habermas, for example, an idea that you should go to the social sciences to have justification of philosophical theories. So basically, you have an idea of what recognition is, but you go to a sort of psychological and sociological account of why things are so. While I don't think that the pragmatist understanding of why philosophy and social sciences, or how philosophy and social sciences should work together is of this kind, because I think a pragmatist would rather be interested in working with social scientists on specific issues. And this, for example, is something which maybe happens more. It's more. You can find it in the way, for example, in France. After, I don't know whether you are familiar with the work of Boltanski and Thévenot, which are maybe the more known and the more translated. But there has been a sort of what is called pragmatic sociology, but there has been quite a lot of people, sociologists, studying pragmatism, working with the pragmatists, and basically this is one of the reasons why I'm in an institute, which is an institute for the study of history and social sciences. And the idea is that this alliance, this way of working together, is rather to bring together analytical tools for studying sort of specific situations, like what the French would call affairs or scandals or controversies. And so you have a much more situation-oriented approach, but which still relies on a joint collaboration. And I think this is, it's worth emphasizing because it's a quite particular way of understanding how philosophy should produce its consequences and which kind of also of outcome it should produce.
I have a question about that, maybe. Last thing, it's related to what Dave was saying about coming from a different angle. Because Dave was saying, well, it seems as if pragmatism, and you were saying, as if pragmatism is not proposing a sort of universal answers or anything like that. It's more kind of empirical approach, experimental approach of sorts. But on the other hand, I heard you use a lot, concepts that seem to imply kind of already settled view on what is the correct normative outlook in life or something like that. So for instance, when you emphasize things like we have to build a healthier society, right? So that kind of presupposes we already know what healthy societies look like, right? And that the thing to do is to sort of promote human associations where flourishing can happen and all those things, human flourishing. And more inclusion, right? The emancipatory end is there has to be a kind of more inclusive relation between people, where people are not exploited or things like that. And so basically what it boils down to is, well, democracy, right? Kind of. What we need is a democratic kind of government. And that has been settled. That kind of political question, very important political question, perhaps is settled. And that democracy is the sort of way to contribute to human flourishing. Now, if you were a kind of more suspicious Nietzschean, you might say, wait a second, are we sure that democracy is really contributing to human flourishing, right? Or is this maybe just a ruse? We've been duped into thinking that democracy is the way to go because it's supposedly more emancipatory and all those things. But in fact, when you discover what's going on in democracies, is the mediocritization of human beings, right, basically. And we're becoming more and more like flies. And go and behold, we're not really flourishing, we are decaying, right? So the pragmatist, though, has already settled on this very important issue. So when they talk about experimentation, they're saying, well, we're going to experiment within the confines of our already defined view of what is the proper kind of political order of sorts, right? Namely, it's a democratic order where we're trying to be more inclusive, everybody has a say, there are no relations of domination or anything like that. But,
Shouldn't we be critical of that maybe, or
Well,
suspicious about it, or
yeah.
shouldn't we experiment with other forms of government, right, or something? I don't know. So if we're going to be really experimenters,
doing it.
yeah, sure. Right. If we're going to be really experimenters, right, why not go all out, right? Why have we already settled on not experimenting thus that far?
We have already.
We have.
We have. I mean, that's what
Okay.
we haven't. I mean, I think that the point. I mean, what that would have taken me quite a bit far from there, but in Dewey's mind, I think that if we stay to this historical reconstruction of his thought, and maybe this is the idea why you don't find more articulate theories of society, is that basically he wants to set a sort of general philosophical framework which is fallibilistic in its outlook, and we can say is proceduralistic in this philosophy, in political and social implications. Which basically means that you have layers of more or less. At least this is my explanation of how things should work, because of course this is the big question also of Habermas, and how do you make facticity and validity stay together? And but the point I think is what he's trying to do basically is that he is going to set some general. I would call it maybe a general anthropology, which is a very basic understanding of us as being social being, which is basically the only thing with the methodological experimentalism that Jews would ask you to buy. Then the question is, within this framework, he offers an historical account, and also this would be, another step would be to see that for Dewey, justification is an historical practice. So basically, the point is not that we can, in a way, take democracy for granted and just experiment within. The point is to provide an account that shows that through the history of the 4 last centuries of basically Western civilization, from the 17th century on, we have gone through huge social transformations, technological, economical. So and here comes, if you want, a normative element, which is to say, one of the main things of this transformation is that it has brought about a tremendous augmentation of the interpersonal exchanges. So we become more and more intercommunicating. So the kind of a political regime which could have functioned before, where basically there was a smaller community, where the state has a rather limited power, and so where also the capacity to control and to influence others in life was much more limited. In a society like our own, the only way you have to avoid a huge explosion of conflict and disruption is to take the more people as possible involved in the decisional process. So the argument, first the argument is historical, which means we don't know which kind of society is going to happen in a century. Maybe democracy will be overcome because of new transformations. And also, I would say it would not exclude, but would not bet on political philosophy, discovery, and new political arrangement. But certainly on social and natural transformation, changing the way of our staying together and calling for a different way of arranging political life. But I think the normative argument you have is that we need democracy because it is simply the most efficacious way to deal with such a huge intensity of interactions. And this is the only way to manage the forces which are developed by so many people interacting in so many ways, communicating, exchanging, etc.
But I guess,
so
isn't that up for grabs? I could certainly hear, I'm not going to make the argument, but I could certainly hear somebody make the argument that, you know what, democracy is kind of getting in the way of solving conflicts. In fact, we've left it to democracy, and look where it got us, right? We are basically on the brink of driving our planet out of existence because we cannot get together to decide, you know what, stop burning fossil fuels and doing all this stuff, and you know, we're in the brink of wars that are each time more dramatically, you know, powerful, that can obliterate our whole species and stuff like that. We're developing viruses that can like destroy us all and stuff, and so it's crazy, right? And part of the craziness is, I can hear somebody making an argument like this, that we are in a democracy where everybody kind of do whatever they want, kind of idea, and look what it gets, right? And so what we need is, forget about we need rule from above. Somebody that comes and says, you know what, let's get rid of all this fossil fuel burning and let's do this thing, and then problem solved. Something like that, right? And so, is it really so true that democracy is the way of avoiding conflicts? Well, somebody might come with managing conflicts, because yeah, you don't want to avoid them all altogether, I guess, right? From a pragmatist view.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know, right? So
I think you have to historicize the answer. I mean, I think a way to reply would be, I mean, it's up for grab in the sense that he was trying to give an argument for the way society was changing at the beginning of the 20th century.
sure.
It was not going, I mean, it's not, I don't know, Bob Tallis saying that there is an epistemic justification of democracy. So, because democracy is justified on epistemic grounds, it's justified forever, for all the centuries, because we have to know the truth, because as human beings we need the truth, and the only way to know the truth is to be in democracy.
Yes.
So, the point would be, there were social transformation which I don't know whether that couldn't be anticipated a century ago, but that wasn't in the agenda.
Yeah.
So the challenge would be, I mean, it's on our shoulder. It's not on. So I think.
But I guess the challenge is pragmatists are very optimistic. They should be more like the Germans, pessimists, right? They should say, by golly, right? If you leave it in the hands of human beings, we're gonna end up all dead, basically, because you know we're not very good at ruling ourselves, right? And so
I think the point was.
I think we have that pessimistic view very prevalent today, right? I mean, if you take a survey, a lot of people are not very optimistic about the future of the human race right now.
Would you prefer to live in Saudi Arabia,
No,
in
of course
Sudan,
not.
in Russia?
Well,
this is the point, I
right.
think.
So, but what I'm saying is, it's not so clear that democracy, right? I mean, I can hear somebody say.
Yeah,
For
I think
me it is.
the point of democracy for you is, I mean, it's really, I mean, try to find a way to identify who is being involved by certain consequences of something, and try to have his say, because in this way we be involved, we care about, etc. Now, of course, the point which was already clear at this time, you know, there is this chapter of his public and his problems where he speaks about the eclipse of the public, where basically the idea, which is a challenge for democracy, is in the small town community. Of course, we know each other, so basically we sit around the table, and this is the direct democracy. But the more globalization goes this way, the more now the first assumption would be, now there are, which by the way is made by many people like James Bowman or Nancy Fraser today, with all the transnational publics. Of course, you have already. I mean, if you see this, as by the way these people see it from Jewish notion of the public, of course the first conclusion is the solution is no more representative democracy at the level of national states, because when you have transnational publics, a national state simply fails to represent the kind of interest which, for example, is represented by us as human beings who just want, or by the next generation, or by people who care about the environment, because then, I mean, now the pollution goes from a state to another, so you cannot just control by a referendum. I don't know, in Italy, 15 years ago, we made a referendum to not to have nuclear plants, which may be a nice thing, but we have Switzerland at 50 kilometers, and France at 80 kilometers, and Russia at 500 kilometers, but then it came with Chernobyl. And so, I mean, the point would be, the point of democracy would be, how do we make how do we identify the public concern by the issue, and how do we make it count into the decision? So I think that, I mean really contemporary reflection about pluralization of public is the way Dewey would have seen fit developing his reflection about democracy. Where, I mean, I think it's important to say democracy is, this is why, by the way, I said, try to see democracy as a social philosophy concept, not as a political philosophy concept. So basically, it's a concept that tells you in which way people can go around together. Then, of course, if the publics are transnational, the solution is not territorial representativity. Then, which is a solution? I don't know. I mean, maybe none of us. Maybe we have ideas, but I mean, it's a big issue.
Yeah, we have time for one more.
This is to take us in a completely different direction, though this was a really fruitful exchange. The paper was really helpful in thinking through a lot of these things, and one of the this is a where you're going to go from here question, because one of the things I was thinking about, at least the first generation critical theorists were really interested in aesthetics and art, as is Dewey, right? And so, is this another dimension of social philosophy in which they could be compared, and that you could continue this kind of work? I mean, it is such an important realm of association.
Well, I mean, I don't have a good knowledge of the first of the critical theory understanding of of aesthetics. I think one important point would be that there was, at least as far as I understand Adorno's aesthetics, for example, a sort of nostalgic leaning toward the idea that basically in a world which is hopeless, art can, in a way, I wouldn't say save us, but it is a sort of, is giving to aesthetics what is not ready to give to politics, in a way. While in Dewey, you have a stronger emphasis on political practice, on participatory, etc., being the key to the emancipation from present conditions, and aesthetics in Dewey. I mean, you can. I think you can find parallels, but not on this question of. I would say that I don't know what you think about, but I tend not to see Dewey's aesthetics as being so important in his social philosophy. He is important for his theory of experience, for his general philosophy, even for his theory of logic, because he's a way of. It's there as he explains how sensation, thought, perception are wove together. But I think it's not a chance that I have no quote from Dewey's artist experience in my paper, because I don't see any important connection. But maybe.
Well, I mean, one suggestion might be, I mean, just read Martin Jay's book, Songs of Experience, and he talks about Adorno. He also talks about Benjamin's focus on experience in Dewey, and I think they all thought that our day-to-day life, particularly in contemporary, corporate, more increasingly corporatist and media-saturated cultures, they were all concerned with what experience was like for in the home, in the workplace, in day-to-day life in the city. And so, one connection is, Dewey thought that the emancipation of experience meant the having of more aesthetic experience, in the sense of just sense of completion, a sense of just fulfillment. And I mean, that's in Benjamin too. So there's this connection of their concern with experience as being, so that the healthy society is the one where people are having more aesthetic experience, where aesthetic experience doesn't just mean sort of the standing in front of a painting, but the sense that you're starting tasks and completing them, that your work is not repetitive and numbing, and it's a concern with alienation as the opposite of sort of fulfilling and meaningful daily life. So that might be.
Yeah, but I wonder whether in Dewey you have this idea that basically when you talk about art or you talk about aesthetics, the point is to emphasize the continuity between the refined aesthetic experience you can have with a work of art, and the kind of aesthetic experience you have enjoying your work. So basically, art in the sense of Beaux-Arts is just a sort of small portion of his talking about aesthetics. While I think in the critical theory, it's much more about the theory of music, about the theory of aesthetic work of art, at least in Adorno. And so this, I mean, the point of convergence or discussion would be how do they stand compared to this continuum? Because of course, if you take it aesthetic experience in this extended sense, you have this emancipatory, but which is, I think, is for Dewey would be more when you say that art can save you, if you want to use a sort of rhetorical expression, is not by understanding learning to understand the works of art, but is by reforming the relationship between thought and action in work. So I don't know whether in the critical theory we would call this aesthetics. I mean, because it's real there is this idea of consummation, which is the moment of fruition, but which is an anthropological universal. We are in aesthetic consummation anytime when we drink, when we eat, when we enjoy working in a right way, and lately and finally when we appreciate a work of art. But it's really the most refined, the end of a much more broader shape of.
I think that's all we have time for, but there's food, so I hope that those who can stick around. And thank you, Roberto.
Thank you.